Hello, students. Well, in our second lecture, we're going to talk about really earth-shattering event for the history of Europe, namely the Protestant Reformation. Before 1517 in Europe, there were some Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. There was a small percentage of Jews scattered around in different places in the Christian world. And there were a few Christians here and there who disagreed with the Pope on matters of faith, but for the most part, almost everybody in Europe was a Roman Catholic Christian during the Middle Ages. But that was about to change, and the catalyst for the change was a German named Martin Luther, who was born in 1483. Now, Martin Luther, interestingly, started his career as a Catholic priest. He was a member of a religious community, lived in a monastery, and he taught scripture studies at the University of Wittenberg in Germany, part of the Holy Roman Empire. And he was a good teacher and a good priest. But Martin Luther had a problem. Namely, he wasn't sure whether he was saved. That is, whether he was going to heaven. And in order to understand his doubts, we need to examine briefly the Catholic theology on how someone was saved. Catholic Church teaches that anybody who goes to heaven is saved by the grace of God through the gift of faith. But it also teaches that in order to go to heaven, it's necessary for people to also do good works, good deeds, either for God or for their fellow human beings. Now, Martin Luther was doing good works. He was doing a good job as a priest. He was very dedicated to his students. The problem was, even though he was doing the good works, he didn't feel like he was saved. And this problem tormented him for years, until one day he was in his monastery, in the tower of the monastery, reading the scriptures. And he fell upon St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 16, which reads, "The just man is saved by faith." And at that moment, a light bulb went on in Martin Luther's mind, and he said, aha, salvation is only about the gift of faith. It has nothing to do with any good works that you or I might do. It's entirely a gift of God. And Luther found this revelation extremely liberating. It helped to resolve all of his doubts, so that he came to believe if he could only have faith in God, then he would be saved, no matter what he did or did not do. And as Luther began to develop his ideas, he came up with three slogans that encapsulated his teaching: faith alone, grace alone, and scripture alone. Now, the first two of these slogans obviously have to do with the tower experience and the idea that salvation is simply a gift from God. Scripture alone was also a pretty decisive break with Catholic teaching, because the Catholic Church had always taught that the scriptures were one source of certainty about the truths of faith, but there were other sources, namely the tradition of the early church fathers, and also the teaching of the Pope and the bishops, that Catholics should consult all of those sources for guidance on how to live. But now Luther is saying, no, all you need is the Bible to know how to live a good Christian life. You don't need the guidance of the Pope or church tradition. So as Luther became more and more convinced of these ideas, unwittingly, because he never really intended to break with the Catholic Church, he began to move farther and farther away from Catholic Church teachings. But The event that sparked the Protestant Reformation actually took place in the year 1517, and it had to do with the issue of indulgences. Now, you hear that term, you might think an indulgence is a license to sin, to do whatever you want to indulge yourself and still go to heaven. But the Catholic Church's practice of indulgences is a little more complex than that. And we need to understand it in order to understand what triggered the Reformation. Basically, Catholics believe that in addition to heaven and hell, there's a third place in the afterlife where most people actually go before they go to heaven. And this place is called purgatory. The idea is that most people, when they die, are not pure enough, they're not holy enough to go directly into the presence of God. And so, before they enter heaven, they have to be purified of their sins and their bad habits. And so, the Catholic Church teaches that many people spend time in this place called purgatory, being purged of their sinfulness. Now, during the Middle Ages, the popes started to give out what were called indulgences as a way for people to shorten their time in purgatory. And the idea is that if someone does a certain kind of good deed, they can receive the indulgence, and then they can expect that they will have less time in purgatory as a result. For example, during the Middle Ages, the popes gave an indulgence to people who went on crusade against Muslims in the Holy Land. So if you were willing to go and fight for the cause of Christianity against Muslims, you would receive the indulgence in hopes of spending less time in purgatory and going to heaven faster. But not everybody could do a kind of magnificent deed like that. And so over time, the popes began to say, well, you can get the indulgence if you buy it, spend money for it. And in 1517, there was a priest named Tetzel who was going around Germany selling indulgences to raise money for the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And Luther was furious about this because it represented everything he disagreed with in the official teaching of the Catholic Church. The idea that you could go to heaven simply by doing good works, and especially by giving money to the church, Luther found very offensive. And so Luther wrote up a document which was basically 95 bullet points containing his objection to the theology of indulgences. And he marched down to the church in Wittenberg and he nailed it to the front door, and the Protestant Reformation began. Because very soon the news of Luther's act of defiance spread throughout the Holy Roman Empire, and also the text of the 95 Theses spread rapidly because of a recent invention, the printing press. And so now you could print and mass produce documents for people to read. And so many people read the 95 Theses and they became convinced by Luther's arguments against the teachings of the Catholic Church. And so ultimately, as a result, many Germans embraced the Lutheran faith, a new Lutheran church that was created based on the teachings of Martin Luther. And so they became Protestants, the other great branch of Christianity besides Catholics. Now, needless to say, the leadership of the Catholic Church was not going to take this lying down, and in 1520, the Pope of the day, whose name was Leo X, issued a document which excommunicated Martin Luther. That meant that he was kicked out of the Catholic Church. And in doing so, Leo X did not mince any words. He called Luther, quote, the wild boar, that's a feral pig, who has invaded the Lord's vineyard, end quote. Well, Luther's response was basically to say, nuts to you. and he burned the document, excommunicating him from the Catholic Church. And from then on, he was in open rebellion against the Catholic Church leadership. And this became a huge issue within the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor at that time was a man named Charles V, and he was a very committed Catholic, and he was very concerned that the disagreement between Catholics and Protestants would disrupt the unity of the empire. And so he called a meeting called the Diet of Worms. Now, this has nothing to do with eating worms. Worms was a city in Germany, and Diet was simply another name for a meeting or a congress. And so basically, he called important people from all over the empire to meet in the city of Worms to discuss what to do about Martin Luther. And actually, the Diet of Worms condemned Martin Luther and said that he was a heretic, that is, someone who disagrees with the teachings of the Catholic Church. But Charles V didn't want Martin Luther to be turned into a martyr for the Protestant cause, and so he quietly allowed Luther to escape from the Diet and not to be burned at the stake, which was the usual punishment for heretics. And so Martin Luther took refuge with a Protestant nobleman who was called the Elector of Saxony. And from there, he continued to spread his teaching. Now, there were many people in Germany who were very enthusiastic about Martin Luther's teachings, and sometimes they took them far beyond what Luther himself actually intended. And that was the case in the year 1525, when a group of poor peasants who were inspired by Luther's active rebellion against the Catholic Church leadership decided to rebel against their own leaders, the nobles and the lords who ruled over them, and to stage a revolt. And this is called the Peasants' Revolt of 1525. And they appealed to Martin Luther for help, expecting that he would approve of their act of defiance against authority. Well, Luther's response was to publish a pamphlet with the title, "Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants," from which you can gather that Luther totally rejected the Peasants' Revolt and refused to help their cause in any way. And there were a number of reasons for that. First of all, Luther actually was a very conservative man in many ways. He really didn't intend to start a revolution within the church. And especially in terms of politics, Luther believed that Christians should be obedient to their rulers normally, unless the rulers refused to allow them to worship God according to their own conscience and the method prescribed by Martin Luther. Luther advocated obedience to political authorities, but of course he also knew that he needed the support of the rulers of Germany, namely the dukes and counts and princes who ruled over the different parts of the Holy Roman Empire. And so obviously he really didn't want to offend those people either. And many of them did become Lutheran for a number of reasons, partly because they sincerely agreed with Luther, but also there were a lot of advantages to becoming a Protestant ruler. For example, in the Catholic Church, there are, of course, religious orders of priests, brothers and sisters, nuns, and in this period of time, the monasteries and the property that was owned by the church represented an immense sum of wealth. And so if a ruler broke with the Catholic Church and joined the Lutheran Church, then he or she could take over these properties that belonged to the Catholic Church and take the wealth and the jewels and the fantastic artworks that were in there and use them to build up their own government. And so it was a real advantage to the states within the empire to do this, and many people embrace Lutheranism. I don't want to say for that reason, but it was certainly one advantage of becoming a Lutheran. Now, Martin Luther was obviously not the only great leader of the Protestant Reformation. Another important reformer was a Frenchman named John Calvin, or Jean Calvin, who was born in 1509. John Calvin was an intellectual, very intelligent man who studied at the greatest university of the time, the University of Paris. And while he was in Paris, he became convinced of the truth of Protestantism. And then, starting in 1536, he set out to write a book that would contain his views on what the Christian church should look like, a reformed Christian church. And this book was called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. It came out in many editions over many years as Calvin continued to add to his teachings. In that same year, 1536, Calvin got an opportunity to actually build the kind of church he was imagining. And this happened when the citizens of Geneva, Switzerland, invited him to come and to spread his teachings there. And over time, through many ups and downs, John Calvin managed to take over the city of Geneva and to create a government there of the sort that we call a theocracy. A theocracy is a government basically that is controlled by a religious group, or at least where the church and the state really work together very closely. In the modern world, we still have theocracies. For example, the more extreme Muslim nations like Iran and the region controlled by ISIS are certainly theocracies, and their law, their government are based on religious principles of Islam. And that's the kind of government Calvin created in Geneva for Protestantism. Now, John Calvin, as a theologian, is famous for his idea of predestination. And this belief would become very typical of all the Reformed or Calvinist churches that followed in his footsteps. So, what does this mean, predestination? Well, basically, Calvin took Luther's ideas about salvation, he took them one step farther. If you examine Luther's teachings, he's saying that salvation is entirely God's gift. It has nothing to do with any action of ours. And if you think about that a little bit, it really implies that God alone decides who to give that gift of salvation to. In other words, only God decides who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. And this is what John Calvin pointed out, that salvation is entirely determined by God before we're even born. He knows whether we're predestined to go to heaven or to go to hell. And so that became the hallmark of Calvinist teaching. Now, you may ask yourself, why would anybody want to believe that? It's not, in a sense, how people who believe in God think of God today. I mean, people tend to think of God as a loving God who doesn't want anyone to go to hell. So why would he predestine people to heaven or hell? But for the people of Calvin's day, many of them found this idea incredibly liberating, especially if you could convince yourself that you were predestined to go to heaven. Wow, what a relief. It really took a lot of pressure off. You know, you didn't have to worry about every little mistake or fault or sin. If you could believe that God had chosen you for heaven, you were home free. Now, there were people in the Calvinist regions who went crazy because they became convinced that they were predestined to hell. And so that did happen sometimes. But For the most part, um, Calvinists came to believe that they were assured of salvation, and they found that belief very comforting and extremely empowering. And so Calvin's teaching spread throughout Europe and also to America as a result. Now, that did not mean that you could do whatever you wanted. If you were a follower of Calvin, you might think if you're assured of heaven, no matter what, woohoo, let's party and do whatever we want. But that was not what Calvin was getting at all. He really wanted Christians to lead godly, moral lives according to the teachings of the Bible. It was just that he believed that any good or ill deeds we may commit have nothing to do with whether we're saved. But he still wanted Christians to lead moral lives, and so the government of Geneva was a very strict regime in which people were constantly being watched by their neighbors for any signs of sinful behavior or Catholic behavior for that matter. And they could be reported to authorities and hauled before committees and punished, which also may sound horrible to us, but really, Calvin was trying to create a godly society as he saw it. In a sense, what Calvin was trying to do was to create the kingdom of God on earth, to create a perfect society. So even though this is not the kind of society we're used to, there was a lot of idealism invested in it. And when Calvinists like the Pilgrims or the Puritans brought Calvin's teachings to New England, that was their goal as well in the American colonies, to try to also create a holy and godly society where people treated each other with love and respect, and where there was peace and harmony. So that was Calvin's goal for Geneva. Now, the nation of England also became Protestant, but the Reformation in England happened in a very different way, and the outcome was quite different from the Reformation on the European continent. In England, the Reformation had to do with the marital problems of King Henry VIII, who began his reign in the year 1509. Henry VIII was the second king of the Tudor dynasty, and if you've seen any of the program, the HBO drama called The Tudors, which was on a few years ago, then you already know the story that I'm about to tell. Henry VIII was married at a young age to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon. Previously, Catherine had been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. But Arthur died young, and so when he died, Catherine agreed to marry Henry instead, and they became the King and Queen of England. And they were married for about 20 years. They had several children, but all of them died young except for one daughter, who later became Queen Mary the First of England. Now, Henry, however, really wanted to have a son, and there were good reasons for that. No woman up to that point in time had ever been the ruler of England in her own right, and because his family they were newcomers to the throne of England, Henry really thought that in order to keep his family on the throne of England, it was necessary to have a son. In 1527, Henry fell in love with a young woman at court. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn really handled this relationship beautifully. She just had Henry VIII wrapped around her finger, and ultimately Henry decided he had to marry Anne Boleyn in hopes partly of having a son, and that he wanted to divorce Queen Catherine. Now, in the Catholic Church, of course, divorce is not recognized, but there is a procedure called an annulment, If you can prove that your marriage was not valid from the beginning, you can receive an annulment and remarry. And so Henry went to the Pope and argued that because Catherine had been his brother's widow, the marriage was unlawful according to the Bible, and he asked for an annulment. Now, the Pope at this time was Clement VII, and Clement VII didn't know what to do. I mean, he didn't want to offend Henry and take the chance that England would go Protestant, but on the other hand, um, he could not afford to offend Catherine because her uncle was none other than Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who could make life very difficult for the Pope if he granted the annulment. And so Clement did what any of us might do in that situation. He stalled and refused to do anything for some years. And eventually, Henry VIII got tired of being stonewalled by the Pope. And in 1533, he got an English bishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to issue the annulment illegally, so that he then could marry Anne Boleyn. However, it should be said that Anne Boleyn did not last very long. After about 3 years, Henry accused her of treason when she had only had a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, and had her head chopped off. So she was the second of Henry VIII's 6 wives, two of whom were executed. Not the husband of the year. Well, anyway, after Henry married Anne Boleyn and made her the queen, he got the English legislature, the Parliament, to issue a law called the Act of Supremacy, which said that from now on the Pope is no longer the head of the church in England. Rather, the king or the queen will be the head of the church in England, the supreme head. And that law is still in effect to the present day in the United Kingdom. The supreme head of the Protestant Church of England is Queen Elizabeth II. And so from this point on, England is a Protestant country. That is, they've separated from Rome. They're no longer part of the Catholic Church. And most people in England went along with this, but there were a few holdouts, the most significant of whom was the Lord Chancellor of England, one of the highest legal officials in the kingdom, who was named Sir Thomas More. Thomas More was a brilliant scholar. He was famous throughout Europe for his intellectual abilities. Excuse me. And he refused to accept the divorce or the remarriage or the Protestant Church of England. And so King Henry VIII had Thomas More put in jail in the Tower of London. And finally, in 1536, Thomas More was beheaded. And just before his execution, he said these words, quote, "I die the king's good servant and God's first," end quote. Well, the Catholic Church believes that Thomas More died for the Catholic faith, and so he's considered a martyr and a saint. But his action did nothing to stop the Protestant Reformation in England. So what you get on the island of Great Britain is a sort of unusual situation. In England, you have the Church of England, which is sometimes called the Anglican Church. Now, the day-to-day running of the Church of England is carried out under the leadership of bishops, and so we call it an Episcopal Church because the Latin word for bishop is episcopus. And that's why the Church of England in America is called the Episcopal Church as well. The Church of England was almost like the love child of Calvinism and Catholicism. In terms of theology, it was somewhat Calvinist, but if you went to a Church of England service, except that it was in English, not Latin, you might at first think you were in a Catholic service, because you'll see things that are quite similar. You'll see a priest dressed in special clothes, candles. You might hear chanted music, and so forth. And so, on the surface of it, the Church of England's worship looked very Catholic. But it's important to realize that the northern part of Great Britain, Scotland, at this point in time, was still a separate kingdom, and they had their own Reformation that was quite different. In Scotland, a church was set up that was called the Kirk in the local dialect, and this was a Presbyterian church. What does that mean? Well, a presbyter is just another term for a minister. And so the Presbyterian Church of Scotland was controlled by the ministers themselves, who would get together in large meetings called synods and make rules and decisions for the church in Scotland. And the worship, as well as the theology, was much more Calvinist than the Church of England. And so Presbyterian church worship was very simple. It centered on a very long sermon, sometimes 2 hours or more in length, and scripture readings, sometimes singing of psalms from the Bible. That was about it. So it was really a more radical Reformed church than the Church of England. And over the years, many Scottish missionaries came to this country and established churches that are called Presbyterian churches here. So this has been a very influential faith in the United States as well. Although most Presbyterians nowadays don't stick to the strict Calvinist theology. Some do, but many do not. Well, at this point, you might think that the Catholic Church was really down for the count and about to expire, but the Catholic Church rebounded and really began to regroup in a movement that is called the Counter-Reformation, or sometimes the Catholic Reformation. After Clement VII, you have a series of several popes who really are committed to dealing with some of the problems in the church that helped lead to the Protestant Reformation and to reform the church. And so, in order to achieve this in 1545, a great council of the Catholic Church began to meet in the Italian city of Trent, a council of bishops, to discuss what to do about Protestantism. Now, the Council of Trent did not change any fundamental Catholic teachings. They didn't accept Luther's ideas about salvation or Calvin's ideas. They decided to keep the Catholic theology the way it was. But what Trent did do was to try to root out some of the abuses that people had been complaining about within the church for centuries. For instance, priests who were celibate but who had mistresses on the side, priests and bishops who never visited their own dioceses or parishes, and also the ignorance of many of the priests, some of whom could not speak or read Latin. And that was a big problem because the whole worship of the church at that time was carried out in the Latin language. So you have priests that are just standing up in front of the people, rattling off words and having no idea what they meant. And so, in order to deal with that, the Catholic Church began, after Trent, to build the first seminaries, colleges, where priests could be educated so that they could be better teachers to their flocks. Another thing that Trent did was to abolish the sale of indulgences, said that from now on indulgences can never be sold. And with the help of the reform impulse, the church began to recover, also with the help of very important religious leaders in different Catholic countries who set an example. For example, St. Teresa of Avila in Spain wrote a number of books about her religious experiences and her very dramatic prayer life with God. And she also became famous as the one who reformed the Carmelite order of sisters and of priests and brothers, which had become very wealthy and very worldly and not very Christian. But she took the Carmelite order and made it go back to basics and to really lead a simple and very humble life in service of other people and in service of God. And so for this, she became recognized as a doctor of the church, one of the first women ever to be recognized with that title. Another very important leader of the Counter Reformation was Saint Ignatius Loyola, who was from what is now northern Spain. Loyola started out his career as a soldier, but his leg was wounded by a cannonball, and while he was recovering from very painful surgery without anesthesia, he began to explore the religious life and experienced a conversion, and eventually decided to create an organization of priests called the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, and he placed this new group at the service of the Pope. And so popes would send Jesuits on the most difficult missionary enterprises to places like North America, India, China, even Japan was reached by the Jesuits in the 16th century. But the Jesuits became most famous as teachers, and as a matter of fact, there are quite a few colleges in this country that are run by the Jesuit order, like Gonzaga, Fordham, and St. Louis University, where I got my PhD, so I'm quite familiar with Jesuit education. So if you look at the map of Europe, you might have to zoom in a little bit to see this more clearly. You'll see the results of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. The areas in tan remained Catholic. Spain, Italy, most of Hungary, Poland, and most areas of France remained within the Catholic Church. In purple, you'll see the regions that went Lutheran, the northern part of Germany, but also the Scandinavian countries in the far north of Europe became Lutheran. You see the Church of England in green, and north of that you see Scotland in brown, meaning that it is Calvinist. And also you see Switzerland is brown, and certain areas of France became Calvinist as well. Now, there was a great deal of fighting and violence between Catholics and Protestants during the Reformation. You have to understand that that idea of coexisting between people of different faiths really did not exist at this time. People believed passionately that their own way to heaven was the correct way and that everybody else was going to hell, and it was really a matter of life and death for them. And so there was a great deal of fighting. But in 1555, for the first time, there was an attempt to come to some kind of agreement that would stop the violence. And so there was a meeting in the city of Augsburg in the empire to try to come up with a peace treaty. And the result was the Peace of Augsburg. And basically what it said was, the main principle of the Peace of Augsburg was, in Latin, cuius regio, eius religio. That means his realm, his religion. In other words, the ruler of whatever region in the Holy Roman Empire, duke, count, prince, whatever, would decide what religion his people or her people would follow. So if, as in Saxony, the ruler was a Protestant, then all the people in Saxony had to be Protestant. But in Bavaria, the king of Bavaria was a Catholic, and so everybody in Bavaria had to be a Catholic. Cuius regio, eius religio. Well, um, what if you were a Catholic in Saxony or a Protestant in Bavaria? What if you were stuck in surrounded by people who didn't practice your faith? Well, you had the right then to move to a place where your faith was being practiced, where the ruler had embraced your faith. And so this helped to reduce tensions between Catholics and Lutherans, at least. But there were some important loopholes in the Peace of Augsburg that would cause a lot of trouble later. The major one being that the Calvinists, a group that was growing quite rapidly, were not included at the negotiating table, and so they were not part of the agreement. And so the whole question of what to do about Calvinists was totally ignored. Another group that was not represented was called the Anabaptists. Now, the Anabaptists were considered to be very radical by all other Christians at this time. Their basic teaching was that nobody should be baptized as a baby. That you should not baptize people until they were old enough to know what they were doing and to make an actual decision or statement of faith in Christ. Um, Now, Calvinists, Lutherans, and Catholics all baptized babies, and they considered the Anabaptists to be cruel and heartless and barbaric for refusing to baptize infants, because they saw that as shutting the gates of heaven against helpless babies. And so, Catholics hated Lutherans, Lutherans hated Catholics, Calvinists hated Catholics, but basically everybody hated the Anabaptists, and they were persecuted everywhere in Europe, and many of them were killed, martyred for their faith. But they became very important as the ancestors of a number of churches that we still have in our world, in our nation today. For example, the Mennonites and the Amish are Anabaptists. So you know who I'm talking about, the Amish with the beards and the horses and buggies, who lead the very simple, old-fashioned farming lifestyle. They're Anabaptists, and so that's why they have their young people leave their homes for a year to go out in the world, and then they choose and decide whether to stay Amish, and at that point they're baptized. Another very important religious group, maybe hitting a little closer to home for some of you, descended from the Anabaptists, are the Baptist churches. And if you're a Baptist, you know that you cannot be baptized as an infant. I've had Baptist students tell me that nowadays they don't wait till you're an adult, but you have to be at least, say, 9 or 10 years old enough to have some idea of what you're doing when you're baptized. So, very important faith traditions descending from the Anabaptist faith. Let's turn our attention to France for a moment. France was where the problem of Calvinism versus Catholicism really took the most horrific toll. Just to give you a little background, the rulers of France in the mid 1500s were the Valois family. And there's a program on the CW network called Reign, which is actually about Mary Queen of Scots, but it's about her time at the French court of the Valois family. So you may be a little familiar with this part of the lecture. Henri II, King of France, was killed while fighting in a joust, that old-fashioned knightly combat, in the year 1559, and he left 3 sons. The oldest was Francis II, who was married to Mary Queen of Scots. The second became Charles IX of France. The third became King Henri III. But they were all quite young, and none of them lived very long. And so the real power in France after Henri II's death was the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, a member of one of the most powerful Italian families. And so Catherine really controlled her sons and pretty much ran the country for many years. Um, Now, Catherine was dealt a very bad hand. On the one hand, she had the Calvinists, who in France were called Huguenots. Nobody knows exactly why, but that was the term used for them in France, who wanted religious freedom, and some of them who wanted to overthrow the Catholic Church completely. On the other side, you had really conservative Catholics, led by the Duke of Guise, who hated Protestants and wanted to destroy Protestants and kill all Protestants. And so Catherine had to try to keep the peace and steer a kind of middle course between these um, two parties. And for the most part, she did it rather well. But there were several periods when France descended into civil war during her rule, between Calvinists and more extreme Catholics. And these are called the French Wars of Religion that went on intermittently between 1562 and 1593. The most horrific episode in the French Wars of Religion took place on August the 24th, 1572, which was the feast of St. Bartholomew in the Catholic worship calendar, St. Bartholomew's Day. Now, this was supposed to be a very happy occasion because Charles IX's sister, whose name was Marguerite, who was a Catholic, was getting married to a Protestant prince named Henri of the Kingdom of Navarre in southern France and northern Spain today. And this marriage, it was hoped, would bring about peace between Catholics and Protestants. So many Protestants had come to Paris to celebrate the wedding. But while they were there, a prominent Protestant leader whose name was Admiral Coligny became the victim of an attempted assassination by Catholics. When Catherine de' Medici heard the news, she panicked. She was afraid that Protestants would try to get revenge against Catholics for the attempted murder of Coligny, and so she got her son, King Charles IX, to order that Catholics go out on the street and start to massacre Protestants wherever they found them. And so this became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It spread all the way across France. Tens of thousands of Protestants were killed in cold blood. One of the most shameful episodes of this entire century. But it should be said that there was violence on all sides, and there were tragedies and atrocities that took place on all sides. Again, because these people believed so passionately in their own religion. Um, War was almost inevitable until the idea of tolerance took hold. We'll talk about that later. However, Charles IX died childless, and what do you know? The nearest heir to the French throne was none other than Prince Henri of Navarre, a Huguenot, a Protestant. Um, and when Henri III, after ascending to the throne, got himself assassinated in 1589, Henri IV became the king. And as a Protestant, however, he met with a lot of opposition, especially from the Guise and their followers, and so he had to fight to claim his kingdom. And this civil war went on for 4 years. Well, finally, Henri IV got tired of it, and he decided to do the one thing that he knew would bring peace to France, and that was become a Catholic. And so after 4 years of fighting, he finally gave in, joined the Catholic Church, saying, as he did so, quote, "Paris is well worth a mass," end quote. In other words, if I can move to Paris and get my crown on my head and be king, it's worth going to Mass. However, even though Henri IV had become a Catholic, he did not forget about his brothers and sisters who were Protestants. And in 1598, he issued one of the very first documents of religious toleration in European history. It was called the Edict of Nantes. Um, what Henri said in this document was that the Protestants could openly practice their religion in certain parts of France, and he even said that Protestants had the right to build fortifications and to carry weapons in order to protect themselves from events like the Bartholomew's Day massacre. So this was a great step forward for the Protestants in France. However, the Edict of Nantes made him unpopular with many conservative Catholics, and the fact that Henri had become a Catholic made him unpopular with some Protestants. And so it was like he had a target painted on his back. He was um, targeted in 20, yes, 20 assassination attempts, all of which he survived until the 21st finally got him. A fanatical Catholic assassinated Henri IV in 1610. And there was a huge outpouring of grief all across Europe um, because Henri had been respected by many Europeans, Catholic and Protestant alike. And so the death of Henri IV led to a great deal of sympathy for him and for his family. He was from the Bourbon family. So from this point, the rulers of France are called the Bourbons. And his son, King Louis XIII, benefited from that sympathy. And so Louis XIII and his great advisor, Richelieu, who was a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, used this sympathy to build up a theory that kings were sacred, that nobody could touch or do violence to a king's person, and that kings should rule with the absolute power bestowed on them by God. And so this became known as the theory of absolutism, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. Just another of the many consequences springing from this extremely important event we call the Protestant Reformation.